20 signs the American empire is in its final collapse. And I want you to hear that sentence and sit with it for a second, because I know how it sounds. It sounds extreme. It sounds like clickbait. It sounds like something a person says when they've given up or when they're trying to scare you. But I'm not trying to scare you, and I haven't given up. What I've done is I've spent the last several months reading everything I can find, from historians, from economists, from political scientists, from data analysts, about the patterns that appear in every empire before it falls. And what I found is that the United States in 2026 matches those patterns more closely than any society in modern history. And I need to walk you through all 20 signs, not because I want to be right about this, because I want us to be honest about where we actually are, so we can figure out where we go from here. Sign 1. Only 25% of Americans believe hard work pays off anymore. A September 2025 Wall Street Journal-NORC poll found that only 25% of Americans believe hard work leads to economic gain. That is the lowest reading in the history of the survey, which dates back to 1987, and nearly 70% said the American dream no longer holds true or never did. The highest level in 15 years of asking. Let that settle. 3 out of 4 Americans have stopped believing that effort produces results. That is not an economic statistic. That is a spiritual collapse. Because when a population stops believing that the system rewards effort, they stop participating in the system. They stop striving. They stop investing in the future. They stop having children. They stop trusting the institutions. And the empire loses the single most important resource it has. Not money, not military, belief. Every empire that collapsed did so after the population stopped believing in the promise that held it together. Rome's promise was civilization. Britain's was progress. America's was the dream. And the dream, according to 70% of the population, is dead. And I've been thinking about this one a lot, because it hits differently when you realize what that number actually means for everyday life. When only 25% of people believe hard work pays off, the 18-year-old looking at college thinks, why bother with the debt if the degree won't get me anywhere? The 35-year-old considering starting a business thinks, why take the risk if the game is rigged? The 55-year-old thinking about retraining for a new career thinks, why invest the time if it won't matter? The loss of belief in the system doesn't just show up in polls, it shows up in every decision people don't make, every risk they don't take, every business they don't start, every child they don't have, every community they don't build. The belief was the engine. And 3 out of 4 Americans just told you the engine is off. Sign 2. America now spends more on interest than on its own defense. Interest payments on the national debt have crossed $1 trillion per year for the first time in American history. That is more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare. Think about what that means. The single largest expenditure of the United States government is not protecting the country. It is paying interest on money the country already spent. And the debt itself has crossed $36 trillion, which is larger than the entire GDP of the nation. The United States is borrowing to pay the interest on previous borrowing. That is the financial signature of an empire in terminal decline. Spain did it, Britain did it, the Soviet Union did it, and every one of them told themselves it was manageable right up until it wasn't. And the most terrifying thing about the debt is not the number. It's the trajectory. The CBO projects that under current law, interest payments will reach $1.7 trillion per year by 2034. That will make interest the single largest line item in the federal budget, larger than Social Security, larger than defense, larger than everything else combined except Social Security. And every dollar that goes to interest is a dollar that does not go to roads, to schools, to water treatment plants, to veterans, to research, to anything that builds capacity for the future. The debt is consuming the budget from the inside like a parasite that grows faster than its host. And the host in this analogy is you, because your taxes are what fund the interest. Approximately 34 cents of every federal tax dollar you pay right now goes to interest on money that was already spent, on wars that already ended, on stimulus that was already distributed, on tax cuts that were already given. You are paying for the past, and the past is getting more expensive every year. And the people who created the debt, who authorized the spending, who cut the taxes that widened the deficit, are not paying for it. You are, your children will, and their children will, because the debt does not expire, it compounds. Sign 3. American life expectancy is falling, while every other wealthy nation's is rising. The United States is the richest country in the history of the world. It spends more per capita on healthcare than any other nation. And Americans are dying younger than their peers in every comparable developed country. A 2025 study documented 14.5 million excess deaths in the United States between 1980 and 2023 relative to mortality rates in other high-income countries. 14.5 million people who would still be alive if they had been born in Canada, Australia, Germany, Japan, or the UK. And the gap is not closing. It is widening. American life expectancy is now lower than China's for the first time in recorded history. The richest country on Earth produces worse health outcomes than a nation that was classified as developing within living memory. That is not a healthcare problem. That is a civilization telling you through its mortality data that it is consuming its own people. And I want you to understand what 14.5 million excess deaths means, because that number is so large it becomes abstract. That is more Americans than the entire population of Pennsylvania. Gone. Not because of a war, not because of a plague. Because the American system, the healthcare system, the food system, the stress, the overwork, the opioids, the poverty, the pollution, the loneliness, killed them at a rate higher than every comparable wealthy nation on Earth for 43 consecutive years. And those deaths are not evenly distributed. They are concentrated among working-age Americans. People in their 30s, 40s, and 50s dying at rates that peer countries do not experience. Drug overdoses, suicides, cardiovascular disease driven by stress and diet. Diabetes driven by a food system that is optimized for profit, not nutrition. Despair. That is the word that Princeton economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton used, deaths of despair. The empire is killing its own working-age population through the conditions it has created. And calling it a healthcare issue is like calling a fire a temperature problem. The fire is the system. The temperature is the death rate. Sign 4. Manufacturing has collapsed from 28% of GDP to 11%. In 1970, manufacturing represented 28% of American GDP. Today it is approximately 11%. The United States imports approximately $800 billion more than it exports annually. The country that invented mass production, the assembly line, the transistor, the semiconductor, and the internet is now dependent on foreign nations for the manufactured goods its economy requires to function. Taiwan makes 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. China dominates rare earth mineral processing. India produces a third of America's generic pharmaceuticals. The medicine you take, the phone you use, the car you drive, the appliances in your kitchen, the components in your military hardware are made somewhere else, and the supply chains that deliver them run through shipping lanes that can be closed by a single regional conflict. The Strait of Hormuz proved that in February, and nobody in Washington has a plan to rebuild the manufacturing base because rebuilding it would take decades and cost trillions, and nobody in Washington plans beyond the next election. And I think about my grandfather when I think about this one. He worked in a factory in Ohio for 34 years, made engine components, owned a house by 25, raised 4 kids on one income, had a pension, had health care, had a community of coworkers who knew each other's families and went to each other's weddings and barbecues and funerals. The factory is gone now. The building is still there, but it's been converted into something else. And the town that was built around that factory, the diners and the barbershops and the hardware stores and the schools that were funded by the property taxes of the families that worked at that factory, all of it contracted when the manufacturing left. And his grandchildren, my generation and the one after, were told that the loss of manufacturing didn't matter because the economy was moving to services and technology and knowledge work. And that was true for some people, for the people who lived near the new economy, for the people who had the right degrees, for the people in the right zip codes. But for the towns and communities and families that were built around making things, the transition was a death sentence. And 50 years later, those communities still haven't recovered. The opioid crisis hit hardest in the same regions where manufacturing disappeared. The deaths of despair concentrated in the same counties. The population decline was steepest in the same towns. Deindustrialization didn't just change the economy. It destroyed the social fabric of entire regions of the country, and the regions that were destroyed were the regions that had built the empire's productive capacity in the first place. The empire ate its own foundation and called it progress. Sign 5. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. In 1971, Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard. Since then, the dollar has lost approximately 98% of its purchasing power. A dollar in 1971 bought what $7.69 buys today. The money supply has increased by 400% since 2000 alone, and the Federal Reserve created approximately $6 trillion in new dollars between 2020 and 2022 to manage the pandemic an expansion that caused the 26% inflation spike that has repriced every aspect of American life. Currency debasement is the most consistent sign of imperial decline across every civilization that has ever fallen. Rome did it by reducing the silver content of the denarius. Spain did it by mixing copper into silver coins. Britain did it by printing pounds to fund its wars. America does it digitally through quantitative easing and monetary expansion, but the result is identical. The people holding the currency lose purchasing power. The people holding assets gain value, and the gap between the two groups widens until the social contract that holds the empire together collapses under the weight of the inequality. And here is what currency debasement looks like in your life right now, in practical terms that the economics textbooks never use. Your parents bought a house in 1985 for $80,000 on a single income of $35,000. That was 2.3 times their annual salary. Today, the median house costs $420,000, and the median household income is $80,000. That is 5.25 times annual income. The house didn't get 5 times better. The dollar got 5 times weaker. Your retirement target, which you calculated 10 years ago based on the prices that existed 10 years ago, is now approximately 26% further away because the same retirement costs 26% more in debased dollars. If you needed $1 million to retire comfortably in 2019, you now need approximately $1.26 million. And the $400,000 you've saved has not grown fast enough to cover the gap because savings accounts paid near zero interest for a decade, while the Fed was printing the money that caused the inflation that eroded your purchasing power. You were robbed. Not by a criminal, by a policy. A policy made by people who own assets that appreciated during the debasement while your savings depreciated. That is not a metaphor. It is the mathematical consequence of creating $6 trillion in new dollars and injecting them into a financial system that distributed the benefits upward and the costs downward. Sign 6. The dollar's global reserve status is eroding and central banks are buying gold at record pace. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from 71% in 2000 to approximately 59% today. That 12-point decline over 25 years mirrors the trajectory of the British pound, which lost its reserve status over a similar time frame before it collapsed in the 1960s. Central banks in China, India, Russia, Turkey, and Poland have been buying gold at record quantities for 4 consecutive years. Gold has tripled to approximately $4,500 per ounce. The People's Bank of China has reduced its U.S. Treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion to approximately $760 billion. Saudi Arabia has conducted oil transactions in yuan. BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems. These are not rumors. These are documented, quantifiable shifts in the global financial architecture that are slowly, systematically reducing the world's dependence on the American dollar. And when the reserve currency advantage is gone, the ability to run persistent deficits, to borrow cheaply, to consume more than you produce, goes with it. And most Americans don't understand what the reserve currency privilege actually gives them because they've never lived without it. It gives you lower interest rates on your mortgage because global demand for dollars keeps treasury yields lower than they would otherwise be. It gives you cheaper imports because the dollar's strength makes foreign goods affordable. It gives you the ability to run a trade deficit of $800 billion per year without the currency collapse that would punish any other country making the same choices. It gives the government the ability to run massive fiscal deficits and fund them by selling bonds that the whole world wants to buy. When that privilege erodes, which it is doing at a rate of approximately 0.5 percentage point per year, every one of those advantages erodes with it. Your mortgage rate goes up. Your imports get more expensive. Your government's ability to spend without taxing gets reduced. And the lifestyle that Americans have maintained for 80 years, a lifestyle built on the foundation of issuing the world's reserve currency, becomes unsustainable. The British experienced this firsthand in the 1960s and 1970s when the pound lost its reserve status. Austerity, rationing, currency crises, industrial collapse, the sick man of Europe. That's what the loss of reserve currency status looked like for the previous holder. And the American version of that story has not been written yet, but the first chapters are being drafted right now in the reserve allocation decisions of central banks that you've never heard of in countries you've never visited. Sign 7. Trust in every major institution has fallen to the lowest levels ever recorded. Only 22% of Americans trust the federal government to do the right thing, according to Pew Research. Trust in Congress is at 8%. The Supreme Court is at 25%. Television news is at 11%. Newspapers at 18%. Big business at 14%. The medical system has dropped from 80% in 1975 to 34%. Every single major American institution has lost majority public confidence. And the Century Foundation's democracy meter documented that the United States democracy score dropped from 79 out of 100 in 2024 to just 57 out of 100 in 2025, a 28% decline in a single year. The V-Dem Institute, one of the most established democracy monitoring organizations in the world, classified the United States as an electoral autocracy by late 2025. An electoral autocracy. That phrase applied to the United States of America would have been unthinkable a decade ago. It is now the formal academic classification of the country that invented modern democracy. And I don't care what your politics are. I don't care which party you support. That classification should stop you cold. Because it is not a partisan opinion, it is the conclusion of independent, international academic institutions that have been measuring democracy across every country on Earth for decades using consistent methodologies. And when those institutions look at the United States in 2025 and 2026 and produce a number that has dropped 28% in 1 year, that is not politics, that is measurement. And the measurement says something is structurally failing in the governance architecture of the country. And when governance fails, everything downstream of governance fails with it. Healthcare, education, infrastructure, social programs, environmental protection, financial regulation, consumer protection, all of it is downstream of governance. And governance, according to the people whose job it is to measure governance, is in free fall. And here's what makes this sign particularly alarming from a historical perspective. Every empire that collapsed experienced a period where the population no longer believed the government represented their interests. The Roman Senate became a rubber stamp for whoever controlled the military. The British Parliament became irrelevant compared to the power of industrial capital. The French Ancien Regime became a self-serving aristocracy, disconnected from the population it governed. In every case, the institution continued to exist. It had buildings, it had members, it had procedures, but it had lost legitimacy. And an institution without legitimacy is an empty uniform. It has the appearance of authority, but none of the function. 8% confidence in Congress is an empty uniform. Sign 8. The military is deployed in 80 countries while bridges are collapsing at home. The United States maintains approximately 750 to 800 military bases in roughly 80 countries across every inhabited continent. The defense budget request for fiscal year 2026 is $892.6 billion, with the House pushing $925 billion. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars cost over $8 trillion, according to Brown University's Costs of War project. And the American Society of Civil Engineers gives the nation's infrastructure a C- grade, with $4.6 trillion needed to bring it to a state of good repair. Roads, bridges, water systems, electrical grids, airports, public transit, all deteriorating faster than they are being repaired. Military overextension while domestic infrastructure crumbles is not just a budget problem. It is the defining pattern of late-stage empires. Rome did it. Britain did it. The Soviet Union did it. Spain did it. Every one of them prioritized projecting power abroad over maintaining the foundation at home, and every one of them lost both. Sign 9. The birth rate has fallen to the lowest in American history. The U.S. fertility rate has dropped to 1.62 births per woman, the lowest in the history of the Republic. The replacement rate needed to maintain a stable population is 2.1. Bloomberg reported the United States may see its first population decline in 2026. 7 in 10 Americans say raising a child is unaffordable, and declining birth rates are not just a demographic concern. They are a civilizational indicator. Societies that stop reproducing are societies that have lost confidence in the future. The Romans experienced declining birth rates during the late Empire. So did the Ottomans. So did the British. When the population stops investing in the next generation, the empire is consuming its present without funding its future. And the economic consequences are devastating. Fewer young workers means a shrinking tax base, a collapsing social security system, labor shortages in care industries, and a consumer economy that contracts as the population contracts. The worker-to-beneficiary ratio for Social Security has already fallen from 16.5 to 1 in 1950 to 2.8 to 1 today, and is projected to reach 2.1 to 1 by 2040. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to be depleted by 2032, at which point benefits face an automatic cut of approximately 24%. And the only way to fix it without cutting benefits is to add more workers to the system, either through higher birth rates or through immigration. Birth rates are declining. Immigration has been dramatically reduced by policy, and no alternative source of new workers has been identified. The math is closing in from both sides. And the people who will bear the consequences, the retirees who paid into the system for 40 years and were promised it would be there, are the people who have the least time left to adjust. A 65-year-old cannot rebuild their retirement savings. A 70-year-old cannot re-enter the workforce. An 80-year-old cannot cut their medical expenses by 24%. The demographic decline is not just a future problem, it is a present betrayal of the generation that did exactly what the system asked of them. Sign 10. Wealth concentration has reached levels not seen since the last empire's collapse. The top 1% of American households now owns more wealth than the entire bottom 90% combined. The top 10% owns approximately 89% of all stocks. The bottom 50% owns roughly 1%. The Rand Corporation estimated that approximately $50 trillion in income has been transferred from the bottom 90% to the top 1% over 4 decades through the divergence between productivity and compensation. That is not a market outcome, that is an extraction. And extreme wealth concentration is the most reliable indicator of impending social instability in the historical record. Rome's late republic saw its agricultural land consolidated into vast estates called latifundia, while the citizen farmer class was destroyed. The French Revolution was preceded by obscene aristocratic wealth alongside peasant starvation. The Russian Revolution followed the same pattern. When a small number of people capture an ever larger share of the national wealth, while the majority struggles to afford basic necessities, the social contract is being violated. And violated social contracts are what revolutions are made of. And I'm not predicting revolution. I'm observing that the conditions that produced them in every previous case are present in America right now, and the most disturbing part of the wealth concentration data is how invisible it is to the people it affects. The person working 2 jobs to afford rent does not think of themselves as a victim of wealth extraction. They think of themselves as someone who isn't working hard enough. The shame is internalized. The structural cause is invisible. And the billionaire who captures the productivity gains does not think of himself as an extractor. He thinks of himself as a job creator. Both narratives are comfortable. Neither is accurate. The accurate narrative is that the structure of the American economy has been redesigned over 4 decades through tax policy, trade policy, monetary policy, and labor policy to systematically redirect the gains of productivity from the people who produce the productivity to the people who own the capital. And the result is a society where working full-time does not guarantee the ability to pay rent, where 2 incomes cannot fund the middle-class lifestyle that 1 income funded in 1985. Where the gap between the rich and everyone else is wider than at any point since the era that produced the Great Depression. Sign 11, 41% of Americans are lonely and 2/3 never join anything. A national survey in January 2026 found 41% of Americans experience loneliness. The Surgeon General declared it a public health crisis equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. More than 2/3 of Americans never participate in any club, organization, or communal activity. Time spent with friends has dropped 20 hours per month since 2003. 49% have 3 or fewer close friends, up from 27% in 1990. 17% have 0. Social fragmentation is the internal decomposition of an empire. An empire can survive military defeats. It can survive economic downturns. It cannot survive the collapse of the social bonds that hold its population together. Because when those bonds dissolve, the population is no longer a society. It is a collection of isolated individuals who share geographic coordinates but nothing else. No shared purpose, no shared trust, no shared identity, and a collection of isolated individuals cannot coordinate the collective action that national survival requires. And if you want to feel this one in your bones, drive through any American neighborhood at 7 p.m. on a weekday evening. The streets are empty. The porches are empty. The front yards are empty. Everyone is inside, behind closed doors, on their phones, on their screens, in their own separate worlds that overlap with nobody else's. And the neighborhood that used to be a community, where people knew each other's names and watched each other's houses and raised each other's kids, is now a collection of residential units that share a zip code and nothing else. Sociologist Robert Putnam documented this collapse 25 years ago in Bowling Alone. Every trend he identified has accelerated since. Church membership fell below 50% for the first time. Only 25% of young adults talk to their neighbors regularly, down from 59% in 2012. The infrastructure of American community life, the clubs, the lodges, the leagues, the civic organizations, has been hollowed out so completely that most Americans under 40 have never experienced what it felt like to belong to something local and real and sustained. They don't know what they're missing, And what they're missing is the social fabric that every previous civilization relied on to survive its crises. Sign 12, homelessness, hit the highest number ever recorded in 2024. The annual point-in-time count documented 771,480 Americans experiencing homelessness in January 2024, the highest number ever recorded since tracking began. And the number has continued climbing in 2025 and into 2026. In the richest country in the history of the world, 750,000 people are sleeping in shelters, in tents, in cars, under bridges, and on sidewalks. And the visible homelessness is only the most dramatic expression of a housing crisis that extends far beyond the homeless population itself. Home prices have increased 81% since 2017. Rents are up 54%. The median American household now spends over 40% of income on housing alone. The homeownership dream for young Americans is more statistically distant than at any point since the National Association of Realtors began tracking affordability. The empire's people cannot afford to live inside the empire's borders. That is a sign that the empire is no longer for them. And I drove through a mid-sized city last month that I hadn't visited in about 5 years, and I couldn't believe what I saw. There were tents under every overpass, people sleeping on bus benches in broad daylight, families with children sitting on sidewalks with cardboard signs. And it wasn't one block, it was everywhere. And the people walking past them had that look on their faces that I've come to recognize. Not anger, not sympathy, numbness. They've seen it so many times that it doesn't register anymore. The homelessness has been normalized. The tents are part of the landscape now, like traffic lights and mailboxes. And the normalization of homelessness in the richest country on earth is maybe the most damning sign of all. Because it means we have collectively decided that 750,000 people sleeping outside is an acceptable feature of American life. That children growing up in cars is tolerable. That veterans who served this country living under bridges is just the way things are. No civilization that accepts that outcome for its people is a civilization that deserves to call itself exceptional. And the housing crisis that produces the homelessness extends far beyond the people on the streets. 22 million American households spend more than 30% of their income on housing. 11 million spend more than 50%. The waiting list for Section 8 housing vouchers is years long in most cities. And new housing construction cannot keep pace with demand because of zoning restrictions, labor shortages, materials costs, and the NIMBYism of communities that need affordable housing but refuse to allow it to be built in their neighborhoods. Sign 13, education rankings have fallen behind dozens of countries that spend less. The United States spends more per student on education than almost any other developed country. And American student performance in math, reading, and science has been declining on every major international assessment for the past 2 decades. The National Assessment of Educational Progress documented that math and reading proficiency among American students have fallen to the lowest levels in decades. Meanwhile, countries like Finland, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and Estonia consistently outperform the United States on PISA scores while spending less per student. College tuition has outpaced inflation by a factor of 4 over the past 40 years. Total student loan debt exceeds $1.77 trillion. And the jobs the degrees were supposed to secure increasingly do not pay enough to service the debt that funded them. The empire is producing a less educated population at a higher cost, while its competitors produce a more educated population at a lower cost. That trajectory, sustained over decades, is the erosion of the single most important competitive advantage any civilization possesses. Sign 14. The food system is poisoning the population. It is supposed to feed. The United States allows over 10,000 chemical additives in its food supply, many of which are banned in Europe, Canada, Australia, and Japan. Ultra-processed foods now make up approximately 58% of the average American's caloric intake, higher than any other country on Earth. The adult obesity rate has climbed from 12% in 1990 to over 42% today. Childhood obesity has tripled since the 1970s. Food allergies have tripled since 1997. The British Medical Journal linked ultra-processed food consumption to increased risk of cancer, cardiovascular death, type 2 diabetes, and mental health disorders. And the food companies that produce these products are engineering them to override the body's natural satiety signals. The empire is feeding its population a diet that makes them sick, that makes them obese, that gives their children allergies their grandparents never had, and that generates chronic diseases that the healthcare system then treats at the highest cost in the developed world. The food system and the healthcare system are not separate crises. They are a single extraction pipeline. And I think about this every time I go to the grocery store. I pick up a box of something that looks like it should be simple: crackers, or cereal, or a frozen dinner. And I flip it over and there are 40 ingredients and I can pronounce maybe 15 of them. And my grandparents' crackers had 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, oil, done. The modern version has emulsifiers, preservatives, dough conditioners, artificial flavors, colorings, and stabilizers that exist not because they make the cracker better, but because they make it cheaper to produce, longer to last on the shelf, and more addictive to consume. The food industry spends approximately $14 billion per year on advertising, much of it directed at children for products that the British Medical Journal has linked to cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. We are spending billions to convince people, including children, to eat products that will make them sick. And then we are spending trillions to treat the sickness that the products caused. And the people making money on both ends, the food companies and the healthcare companies, are often owned by the same investors, the same hedge funds and private equity firms that hold stakes in PepsiCo and Kraft Heinz also hold stakes in United Health and HCA Healthcare. They profit from the food that makes you sick and from the treatment that manages but never cures the sickness. That is not a conspiracy. It is a business model, and the American population is the raw material that the model processes. Sign 15. The water supply is contaminated, and the infrastructure to deliver it is failing. PFAS forever chemicals are in the drinking water of an estimated 110 million Americans. The EPA documented 9.2 million lead service lines still delivering water to American homes. Microplastics have been found in 100% of human placental tissue tested. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates $625 billion is needed for drinking water infrastructure over the next 20 years. Parts of the Ogallala Aquifer, which supports agriculture across 8 states, have lost more than 60% of their saturated thickness. Lake Mead, serving 25 million people, hit its lowest level since the 1930s. The Colorado River is overallocated, with more water promised than the river contains. When the water runs out in an agricultural region, the food that came from that region does not appear on your dinner table anymore. And when the pipes that deliver your drinking water are 80 years old and contain lead, the government that is supposed to replace them does not have the money because the money went to interest payments and military bases in countries most Americans cannot find on a map. Sign 16. The healthcare system costs more than any other country's and delivers worse results. The United States spends approximately 17.3% of GDP on healthcare, nearly double the OECD average. And on virtually every major health metric, from life expectancy to infant mortality to chronic disease rates to maternal mortality, the United States ranks near the bottom of developed nations. Medical bankruptcy is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in America, a concept that does not exist in most developed countries because their systems prevent it. ACA subsidies expired January 1, 2026, causing premiums to double for 20 million Americans. The Commonwealth Fund estimates 5 million will lose coverage entirely. Health insurance premiums for employer-sponsored coverage have risen 342% since 2000, more than 5 times the rate of overall inflation, and employer deductibles have crossed $3,500 for a family, meaning you pay $3,500 out of pocket before your insurance covers anything beyond preventive care. The empire charges the highest price in the world for healthcare and delivers outcomes that rank below countries spending half as much. That is not a system designed to heal people. That is a system designed to bill them. Sign 17. The political system is paralyzed and cannot address a single structural problem. Congress has not passed comprehensive legislation to address Social Security's trust fund depletion, which is projected for 2032, has not addressed Medicare's trust fund depletion, projected for 2033, has not reformed the healthcare system to reduce costs, has not rebuilt manufacturing capacity, has not addressed the housing crisis, has not reformed the immigration system, has not modernized the tax code, has not reformed campaign finance, has not invested in workforce retraining for AI displacement, has not raised the FDIC insurance limit from $250,000, where it's been frozen since 2010. The governing body of the most powerful nation on earth cannot address a single structural challenge facing its population. Not one, and the reason is structural. The cost of winning an election has become so high that every elected official is permanently indebted to the donors who funded their campaign, and those donors are disproportionately the same corporations and individuals who benefit from the status quo that reform would disrupt. The system is designed to perpetuate itself, not to serve the population. And a political system that serves itself while the population deteriorates is the definition of institutional capture, which historians identify as the terminal phase of every empire's political life. And here's the part that I think about at 2 a.m. when I can't sleep. The Founding Fathers designed the American system specifically to prevent institutional capture. The entire architecture, the separation of powers, the checks and balances, the Bill of Rights, the elections every 2 and 4 and 6 years, was designed to make it structurally impossible for a small group of people to capture the government and use it to serve their own interests at the expense of the population. And it worked for a long time. Not perfectly, but directionally. The system produced reforms when reforms were needed. The Progressive Era, the New Deal, the Civil Rights Era, the environmental protections of the 1970s. Each of those was a response to a crisis that the political system was able to process, debate, and address. And the system's ability to do that is what made America exceptional. Not the military, not the GDP. The ability of the political system to reform itself under pressure. That ability is gone. The political system in 2026 does not reform under pressure. It polarizes under pressure. It fundraises under pressure. It performs under pressure, but it does not reform. And a system that has lost its capacity for reform has lost the one thing that distinguished America from every empire that came before it. Sign 18. AI is displacing workers faster than any technology in human history, and there is no plan. Challenger Gray and Christmas reported 55,000 jobs eliminated specifically by AI in 2025, a 400% year-over-year increase. Cognizant estimates 93% of U.S. jobs can be partially performed by AI. Goldman Sachs estimated 63% of work hours are exposed. The World Economic Forum projects 92 million jobs displaced globally by 2030. Amazon cut 30,000 positions. Salesforce eliminated 4,000 support roles. Meta laid off 8,000 to fund AI infrastructure. And the entry-level jobs that used to be stepping stones to careers are vanishing. Employment for college graduates aged 22 to 25 in AI-exposed fields has dropped 13%. A young person graduates, applies to 300 jobs, and discovers that the ladder they spent 4 years and $100,000 climbing to reach has been removed. And there is no federal retraining program operating at the scale needed. The AI revolution is producing productivity gains captured by capital owners and displacement absorbed by workers. That is the wealth pump operating at maximum speed through the most powerful technology ever invented. And nobody is managing the transition. And I want to tell you what this looks like at the human level, because the aggregate numbers hide the individual devastation. I know a 44-year-old accountant who was told last month that his firm is replacing 60% of its junior and mid-level analysts with AI systems by the end of 2027. He wasn't fired, but he was told that his role would be restructured to focus on AI oversight, which means he'll be managing the machines that replaced his colleagues. And he told me the strangest part isn't the fear of losing his job. The strangest part is what happened to the office. The energy is gone. Nobody talks in the break room anymore. Nobody makes small talk at the coffee machine. Because everyone knows that some of them are staying and some of them are leaving, and nobody knows which category they're in. And the trust, the camaraderie, the sense that they're all in it together, evaporated the day the announcement was made. The AI didn't just threaten their jobs, it destroyed the community that made the jobs worth having. And multiply that story by every office, every firm, every company that is going through the same restructuring right now. Millions of workers sitting in cubicles and conference rooms and Zoom calls, knowing that the system they spent their entire career learning to navigate is being rewritten in real time by a technology that does not need them. And the emotional toll of that uncertainty, the chronic stress of not knowing whether your job will exist in 12 months, is producing the same mental health outcomes that the Surgeon General identified in the loneliness epidemic. Because what is being lost is not just employment, it is identity. It is purpose. It is the answer to the question, what do you do, that Americans use as the foundation of their social identity. When the job disappears, the identity crisis follows. And when millions of identity crises happen simultaneously, the social fabric tears in ways that GDP cannot measure and unemployment statistics cannot capture. Sign 19. The empire is fighting a war that closed a global shipping lane and nobody voted for it. The United States launched a military operation against Iran in February 2026 without congressional authorization. The operation resulted in the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil transits. Oil prices surged from $70 to above $100 per barrel. The IEA called it the greatest energy security challenge in history. The March 2026 CPI showed a 0.9% monthly inflation spike, the largest since May 2022. Consumer sentiment hit the lowest reading in 75 years. The IEA coordinated the largest strategic reserve release in history, 400 million barrels, and the American SPR was drained to its lowest level since the 1980s. The war was launched, the strait was closed, the prices surged, the inflation spiked, the reserves were depleted, and the American public was presented with a ceasefire that collapsed within 24 hours. The cost of the war is being paid at the gas pump, at the grocery store, and through the retirement accounts of ordinary Americans who never voted for it, were never asked about it, and were told everything was under control, while the oil companies privately warned the White House that inventories were at tank bottom. And this sign, more than any other, is the one that connects to the historical pattern most directly. Because unauthorized military adventurism is not just a constitutional concern, it is the behavioral signature of an empire that has lost civilian control of its foreign policy. The Roman Republic became the Roman Empire when military commanders began launching campaigns without Senate approval. The British Empire's decline accelerated when overseas commitments outpaced parliamentary oversight. The Soviet Union collapsed partly because its military commitments in Afghanistan consumed resources that the civilian economy desperately needed, and the political leadership couldn't or wouldn't stop it. And the United States in 2026 is fighting a war in the Middle East that the Congress never voted on, that the public never approved, that has produced consequences the administration did not anticipate, and that the oil companies, the people who actually understand energy markets, are saying will get worse before it gets better. The War Powers Act gives the president 60 days to conduct military operations without congressional authorization. The 60-day clock expired months ago, and Congress has not voted to either authorize or end the war. The institution that is supposed to represent the people's voice in matters of war and peace has been silent. And the silence of the legislature while the executive branch fights a war is not democracy. It is the collapse of the separation of powers that was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. Sign 20, America turns 250 on July 4, 2026, and the average empire lifespan is 250 years. In 1976, British Lieutenant General Sir John Bagot Glubb published an essay called The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival. He studied every major empire of the last 3,000 years and found they all follow the same 7-stage life cycle and last approximately 250 years. The Assyrian Empire lasted 247 years. The Ottoman Empire lasted 250. The Spanish Empire lasted 250. The British Empire lasted 250. Romanov Russia lasted 234. The Arab Empire lasted 246. And America turns 250 this July 4th. And the coincidence is uncomfortable because the evidence supports it. Every sign I've listed in this video, the debt, the currency debasement, the military overextension, the manufacturing collapse, the infrastructure decay, the institutional distrust, the demographic decline, the social fragmentation, the wealth concentration, the political paralysis, the healthcare failure, the education decline, the food contamination, the water crisis, the AI displacement, the unauthorized war was present in previous empires during their final phase. Not some of them, all of them. And I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, America has been through hard times before and always came back. And you're right. America survived the Civil War, survived the Great Depression, survived 2 world wars, survived Vietnam and Watergate, and the 2008 crash and the pandemic. But here's the difference that matters. In every previous crisis, the population still believed in the system, the institutions still had credibility, the currency was still dominant, the manufacturing base was still intact, the military advantage was still overwhelming, the infrastructure was still functional, the social bonds were still strong, the demographic trajectory was still growth. Every previous recovery happened from a foundation that was damaged but structurally sound. The foundation right now is compromised on every dimension simultaneously. That is new. That has not happened before in American history. And the question is not whether America will survive in some form. It will. Nations do not vanish. But the question is whether America will survive as the thing it currently claims to be. The wealthiest, most powerful, most innovative, most democratic society on Earth. Or whether it will undergo the same transformation that Spain, Britain, and Rome underwent, from the center of the world to a legacy power that talks about its past because its present no longer justifies the comparison. That is what is at stake. Not existence, identity. And I want to be clear about something before I end this video. Acknowledging the signs does not mean accepting the outcome. Diagnosis is not death. The fact that millions of people are watching videos like this, reading the data, asking the questions, having the conversations, is itself the most powerful counterforce to the decline, because awareness is the first step toward action. And action, at the individual level, at the community level, at the local level, is the only thing that has ever reversed a civilizational trajectory. No empire was saved by its government. They were saved. When they were saved by ordinary people who saw what was happening and decided to build something better within the ruins. You are one of those people. The fact that you watched all 20 signs means you are paying attention, and the people who pay attention are the people who prepare. And the people who prepare are the people who survive the transition and build whatever comes next. Share this video with every American you know, not to spread fear, to spread awareness. Because awareness is the one thing the decline cannot survive. The empire falls in darkness. It is saved, if it is saved at all, by the people who refuse to look away.